Good afternoon. It's September 12th, 2020, and this is episode 12 of Rob Explains, your daily podcast discussing and explaining cool, random, and interesting things. I'm Rob. Thanks for joining me. So I wanted to do a little something different today. Not that the last few days haven't been something a little different. Part of the Rob Explains podcast comes out of announcements that I do around my office, and I always try to close out the daily, although it turns out to be more like every couple of days announcements, with some daily facts, some facts that people don't know, and just try to open up their mind about generally something that happened that day, or I can tell a story about some way involving that date. So I want to do something kind of like that with this episode, just to get into some facts and trivia, although obviously a little more solemn, because this is facts and trivia about September 11th. Now, some of these things I may have mentioned over the course of the last few episodes, but I'm going to try and put them in a different context. Some of these little factoids and trivia parts actually relate to each other. So stick with me. It's going to be something a little different, and I promise we'll be back to the usual fare tomorrow. So the September 11th attacks, it's estimated, cost over $10 billion in infrastructure and property damage. And of course, the cleanup cost about $750 million. However, it cost about $500,000 to plan and carry out the attacks. Unlike some terrorist attacks, bombs weren't used. It was simply box cutters being smuggled onto planes. But in the planning process, there was much traveling back and forth between the Middle East, Afghanistan, the Philippines, and of course the United States. All 19 of the hijackers actually lived in the United States, some of them for over a year before 9/11. They took training in pilot schools here in the United States. They lived in the United States. And all of those costs added up to be about $500,000. Included in that number is nearly $100 million of art that was lost when the towers collapsed. This includes a memorial to the 93 bombing of the World Trade Center, as well as some paintings by Pablo Picasso. It took over 10 years for the United States to locate and take out Osama bin Laden. Eventually, there was a mission by U.S. Special Forces, SEAL Team 6, in order to do so. And all of that time, there was a $25 million bounty on his head that was never claimed and never collected. At least 200 people weren't taken by the collapse of the buildings, but rather jumped, whether it was a result of the fire on their floors or a feeling of not being able to escape. The fall took less time than it took for the buildings to collapse, less than 10 seconds, and their deaths were ruled a homicide at the hand of the terrorists rather than a suicide. Immediately in the aftermath of the towers falling, 12 people were pulled from the edges of the rubble, and over the next 23 hours, 18 additional people were pulled out alive from the rubble. However, those 30 people were the only people taken out of the rubble alive. After the attacks, it took firefighters nearly 100 days to extinguish all of the fires around Ground Zero. In the weeks after 9/11, alcohol consumption in New York went up by 25%, tobacco consumption went up by 10%, and church attendance went up by 20%. During the destruction and later collapse of the towers, a guide dog named Rosie guided her blind owner down 78 flights of stairs and away from the buildings, taking her all the way to a nearby friend's home. Something else happened on 9/11 that had never happened before. The FAA ordered a national ground stop, which meant that all 4,000 planes that were in the air at the time had to find a place to land immediately. Canada took in some of these planes, and the passengers were actually fed and housed for the next 3 days while no flights were allowed over the United States. But the person to make this order for the unprecedented national ground stop was the National Operations Manager of the FAA, a gentleman named Ben Sliney, and he had started that job at 8 a.m. on September 11th, 2001. So he took the unprecedented action of stopping all air travel a few hours into his first day of work. As early as September 12th, 2001, the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office began receiving patent and trademark requests for 9/11 memorabilia and merchandise, most of that taking advantage of the fact that the Twin Towers resembled the number 11. Much of this was general retail merchandise, some things that you might see on sale in stores or on the street in New York. And for the most part, these patent and trademark applications were denied as being too general, but some of those trademarks and patents were actually granted. And we'll wrap with two relatively positive factoids and trivia pieces. The penultimate factoid: in July 2010, while building the new World Trade Center, or the Freedom Tower, construction workers uncovered the mangled skeleton of an 18th century ship. The ship had been located just under where the car park was for the building that had previously been there, and they dated the wood in the ship's skeleton to somewhere around 1773, and they believe it was a Hudson schooner, which was a one-masted ship that was very popular on the Hudson River around that time. And finally, the last bit of cleanup around Ground Zero actually took place in July of 2013. That's when land surveyors stumbled upon an interesting find. Something that looked like a landing gear wedged between two buildings in an inaccessible alleyway about 3 blocks from Ground Zero. That landing gear was later identified to come from one of the two jets that was used on 9/11, and it was found in a small alley between 50 Murray Street and 51 Park Place. And with the buildings of New York being pressed so tightly together, it is likely that other debris may be found in the future in other areas that are just never checked. So that's just a few of the most interesting and weird trivia factoids about 9/11. And with this episode, we'll wrap up our discussions of 9/11 and get back to our typical episodes tomorrow. Thank you for joining me for this episode of Rob Explains. Look for new episodes daily wherever you listen to podcasts, and subscribe to make sure you don't miss an episode. Find us online on all social media at Rob Explains. Got a comment, question, or query? Or did I get something wrong and you want to correct me? Shoot me an email, rob@robexplains.com, or you can leave a comment down below. I'll check those right after the show goes live. And you can send me a message, anchor.fm/RobExplains/message. And in the form of a voicemail, I can actually include it in a future episode. Once again, thank you for joining me. Until next time, this is Rob. Take care of yourselves and each other. Have a great day.